My name's Mary. Thank you so much for coming to Data and the Greater Good tonight. We have two really, really great speakers, and I'm so excited to hear more from them about their work. Before we get started, we're just going to have David speak a little bit about our sponsors tonight. So the first is David's going to speak about Workbench.
Hi guys, so thank you guys for coming out today. I just want to say a few words on behalf of Workbench here. Workbench is a venture fund in New York City that is focused on enterprise technology. So they love talking to startups and corporates about big data, security, and infrastructure, and the future of work. They've gone ahead and they've created an amazing community here for going ahead and supporting meetups, events, and jobs in enterprise startups. So if anybody is interested in talking to Workbench, let me know. I'm happy to connect you to some of their team members. With that said, I'll pass it back over to Mary here.
Thank you. And then our second sponsor is Development Guild DDI, and I have Kieran here is going to speak for a few seconds.
Seconds? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kieran McTague. I am Senior Vice President and Director of the New York office for Development Guild. And thanks so much for coming tonight. We are really excited about, this is the fourth event that we've had on Data and the Greater Good, which is really closely aligned with what we do as a company. And I think that leads into what do we do as a company. So Development Guild, we are a company that works with nonprofits. And we primarily work with strategic planning, fundraising council, and, oh, John, how are you? I didn't see some alums here. And executive search. So what we try to do is work with nonprofit organizations to really further their mission. And we have an office here in New York City and one in Brookline. We have a lot of Development Guild people here today, and we want, we're going to be around to be here if you want to hear more about what we do. And so we're really grateful to have you here, and we're looking forward to a great evening tonight. So thanks so much. Back to Mary.
Thank you, Kieran. And then we will get into it with tonight's speakers are Sisi Wei, who is from ProPublica, and Nate Landau, who is from New York Public Radio and WNYC. So we're going to start with Nate.
Great. Okay, so I'm Nate Landau. I am the Chief Digital Officer at New York Public Radio, and I am thrilled to be here speaking to you all tonight. And I want to thank Matt and Mary for extending the invitation. One quick disclaimer to all of you, I am not a data engineer or a data scientist myself, but I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and this is a really mission-critical part of the work that we're doing at New York Public Radio, and I want to walk you through some of that. So first, I don't know how many of you listen to WNYC or know anything about who we are, but just a little bit about us. We're almost 100 years old. Which is amazing to think about. I can't wait for 4 years from now when we actually do our centennial celebrations. Our mission is to make the mind more curious and the heart more open, and the spirit more joyful through excellent audio programming that is deeply rooted in New York. And besides all of the lofty things that are in that mission statement and everything that you can see on the screen about who we are, we also really, at this moment in time, are taking our mission to heart when it comes to everything that we're doing to stitch the city together and be a source of local news, speaking truth to power, and providing engaging ways to help citizenry come together with each other in the tri-state area. So a few of our brands, we have WNYC, which is at 93.9 on the FM dial, or AM 820. We also have New Jersey Public Radio. Those three together are premier NPR talk stations in the tri-state area, or in the metro area, I should say. WQXR is one of the nation's largest classical music stations. Recently, we acquired The Gothamist, who some of you might read. This was really in the furtherance of our mission as a local news source. We also have The Green Space, which is an events location downtown, where we have programming about 350 nights a year, so you all should come and see something that we're putting on there. And lastly, we have WNYC Studios, which is our podcasting arm. And beyond being just a local institution, we've really grown into being one of the preeminent producers of podcasts globally. And that's really transformed our business and our ability to reach people. We're now reaching almost 30 million people a month, which is an amazing number of people for a public radio station. These are some of our shows, so maybe you listen to some of them. If you don't, please go and either tune in the radio or go to the Apple Podcast app or wherever you listen to podcasts and listen to one of them. This is just a small sampling. We have many, many. But I'm not really here to talk about New York Public Radio. What I'm here to talk about is data. So this really quickly is what we think of. This is kind of the obligatory funnel slide. So our funnel is to grow our audience, to know who they are, to engage them in conversation, and lastly, to convert them into being members. And working in public radio, it's really amazing. My background is not in nonprofits, and it's in commercial media companies. And to have people who are opening up their pocketbooks to pay for something that is otherwise free really shows you the power of the content that we have and the effect that it's having on people. But all of that said, I am not here to talk about the bottom part of that, because that is a talk in and of itself. We use data for that conversion piece of this all over the place, but what I really want to talk to you about is how we're growing our audience, knowing who they are, and how we're engaging them in conversation. So you might not know it, but we're living through a golden age of narrative audio. Talk radio listening is up across the board. 25% of US adults are listening to podcasts today, and that number is growing really, really quickly. And a lot of this is because audio is an inherently mobile medium. Radio in your car, it was almost the first mobile medium, but now that you can listen to podcasts and carry them everywhere that you go, we really find that people are filling all the spaces in their life by putting on headphones and having a really deep personal connection with the people who are talking to them through their headphones. And technology is really moving us forward, and it's really changing the way that we're able to reach people. So we're now on Alexas and Sonoses and everything else that's out there. But this is a double-edged sword for us, because we are now no longer competing just with other radio stations on the dial. We're competing with just about anybody who has a microphone and a computer. And that's wonderful. We love the diversity of voices. We embrace all of it. We think having a great ecosystem of content is really, really important. That said, it really shined a light on how important it was that we knew who our audiences were, and that we were able to really get a sense of what they were listening to and how we could increase our audience, increase their ability to engage with us, and then lastly, convert into membership. Because we're now competing with everybody from Vox to the Harvard Business Review to Viacom companies to BuzzFeed to anybody in their basement who wants to talk about Dungeons and Dragons or ballet or whatever it is that they want to create a podcast about. So that all sounds great, except for the fact that there's very little data when it comes to audio that is actionable. Traditionally, in the radio world, you get your Nielsen ratings. They come out about 30 days late. And it's a good way to judge where you are against other radio stations, but that's really about it. There's no way to really make actionable decisions based on Nielsen data. In podcasting, it's even worse than that, because there is no data that cuts across the entire podcasting industry. And as we find more people moving from listening to the radio to listening to a live stream to listening to on-demand audio, it's become increasingly obvious that we needed to build something internally and build out capabilities within New York Public Radio to be able to understand who was listening to our content and how they were listening to it. Also, I should say that as part of that, we also really wanted to change the culture of New York Public Radio to really create a culture of data literacy by providing actionable data out to all of our producers and journalists and everything else. I want to be very clear, we don't let data decide what news we cover. We are not a BuzzFeed or anything like that. But we do think it's important to know how we can create content that will compete with a BuzzFeed for people's attention, and that means having data. So there are 3 areas of questions that we have as an organization. So one of them is on the content side. So we need to understand how long people are listening. Does one part of a show resonate better than another part of the show? Can we tease out content affinities? Are people that listening to one show more likely to listen to another show? We have audience questions where we really want to understand who is listening. Not necessarily down to the individual and the name. We're not Facebook, but are you, in your 50s or are you in your 20s? Are you listening in your car? Do you live in Scarsdale or do you live in Brooklyn? These are really important things for us to know. It's important for us to know how we can attract new listeners. And lastly, on the membership side, once we have people that are listening, we have questions around how we can take them on a journey to becoming members with us and how we can get them to raise their hand and say, yes, I would like to help support your creation of this content. There are 2 major problems that we ran up against here. So one of them is disintermediation. Does anybody know what this word means? All right, so it's a big word. Basically what it means is that we have no direct connection to our listeners. When you listen to our radio station, you're listening on your radio. We don't know that you've turned it on or turned it off. Nielsen, who does industry ratings, has people walking around with these things called PPMs, personal people meters. And when those people walk in front of a radio that somebody's listening to, it ticks it off that somebody is listening to this. That's the old way of doing this. In the new world, Apple or Facebook or Amazon or Pandora or Spotify or iHeart, they hold the relationship with the consumer because that's where the vast majority of people are listening to our content. Yes, we have our app and we have our website, but that's a minuscule amount of the listening that's happening. And so to be able to provide actionable data, we needed to find ways to get around this disintermediation problem. The second problem is that we have tons of disparate data sources. So we have, I forget which one is first here, internal systems. So the internal systems that we have our CRM, we've got surveys that we put in market, we've got server logs, we've got our financial systems. Then we have contracted partners. These are third parties that we work with all the time. You probably recognize a number of the names that are up here, but this is Nielsen, it's Google Analytics, it's our email service provider, and others. And lastly, there are the third parties that I was just talking about. So there's Apple, there's iHeart, there's different podcatchers that are out there that people are listening to. Each one of these different areas holds a different piece of information for us. And so for us to really be able to provide actionable information across our organization, we had to find a way to bridge all of these together and look for friendly keys between them and normalize the data. So enter the data warehouse. We embarked on a journey to build the first data warehouse in public radio about 2 years ago, give or take. We hired a team of data engineers and data analysts. Now keep in mind this is at a public radio scale, so we're talking about one of each. But still, it's a team, and that's amazing. We're very lucky to have them. This is a multi-year effort to go through all of those systems that I had on the previous slide and figure out a way to bring the data together so that we can start reporting out to the organization. It's important to note that this is not something that comes naturally in public radio or in journalism. Data is for those of us in this room, this is our lifeblood, but for journalists or producers of narrative shows like Radiolab or other things, they don't necessarily think about data in their day-to-day life. So the data warehouse is really only a tool to help all of those people do their jobs better. And so it's easy for me and my team of engineers to think about this in a pristine world of all of this gorgeous data that we can mess around with, but really a lot of the work has also been on culture change within New York Public Radio to have people embrace data. And for that, we brought in a really great business intelligence layer. We're working with a company called Looker. There are many others that are out there that provides great reports that we can send out to the rest of the organization. So I want to share with you some of the things that we've learned and go a little bit deeper into how we put all these data sets together. So one of them And this is really the first question that we asked. And so we wanted to know how much crossover exists between donors and newsletter subscribers. This was kind of the proof of concept of our data warehouse, because this proved, by being able to answer this question, that we could put two different data sources together. It's not necessarily the most complicated data set, but it was a really important one for us to be able to actually prove that this could work. And so we found that there's about a 60% overlap. Now, some of this, there's a causality mix here where members get automatically subscribed to some of our newsletters, but nonetheless, this also shows us that being able to engage with people in a conversation and make that conversation a two-way conversation is a really important step to building a very strong membership base. So the next question that we started looking at was, where are people listening to content? Do they listen to a full episode? Do they only listen to 2 minutes? And where do they drop off and why? And so this is just one sample episode. We now have this across every episode that we're doing. But as you can see, there's a number of people who dropped off in the first like 2 or 3 minutes. That's natural. This, whatever this is, I can't see the slides. I don't know what it is, but it didn't resonate with them. But then most other people listened all the way to the end, which is amazing. Now, we don't see this in everything that we do, but what this is helping us do is go to producers and say, you know what, move your introduction of who you're talking to 3 minutes into your episode instead of doing it right at the top. Really give people a hook, right? So we're not telling them what to talk about, we're not telling them what the important story is, but we're helping them create content that people are going to really want to engage with and listen to in a better way. So let's see here. How many days do users return to the radio live stream? So with live stream, this is just a simulcast of our radio station. But as I told you before, Nielsen data is not actionable, right? We can't do anything in real time with data that's 30 days old and also isn't very detailed. So, but we can use our live stream as a proxy for radio listening. And so one of the questions we were asking is, how frequently do people listen to our station, right? We know roughly what the overall number of people is. That's not a complicated question, but this one is more complicated because to answer this, we have to find some way to try to figure out who is an individual and how often would they come back. And keep in mind, we're not just doing this on our website, we're doing this over iHeart and over NPR.org, where a lot of streaming happens, and other platforms. So we're pulling together a lot of different information, normalizing it with ETLs and ELTs. Don't ask me to define those acronyms because I don't know what they mean, but my team talks about them all the time. You know, finding hashes and keys that will bring people together. Now, it's still imperfect data. We don't know who individuals are. What we have is IP addresses, we have device IDs, we can munge that together and try to figure this out. What you can see here is that most people only listen for 1 day, which is what you might expect. As you look at this, there are many people who engage with us over long periods of time. And that's really what we want to see. And now this gives us a metric that we can track over time and something that we can actually take action on and watch it move as we start experimenting with different ways to bring people back, whether it's in on-air promotion, whether it's changing our clock, because in radio you live and die by the clock. So what you do at what time, right? Is it traffic and weather on the ones or is it on the tens? Does that affect this chart, right? So this is actually really, really important for us. Another thing, which is related to that one, but it's a little bit of a separate question, is how many different podcasts do individuals listen to? So we always knew how many people were listening to our podcast because we had the server logs that would tell us that X 100,000 people downloaded this show. But was that one person downloading it 10,000 times, or was it 10,000 people downloading it one time? We had no idea. Nor did we know if those same people were listening to multiples of our show. So when we're promoting shows in our portfolio, are we just talking to the same people and moving them across the portfolio, or are we actually growing audience and increasing our reach to different people? So what you can see here is that most people listen to one show, only 3% listen to two. Now, once again, this is not perfect data. We don't know who individuals are. We're disintermediated from them. You might be logged into Spotify, you're not logged into our system, so we're using weird math. I think of it as weird math. You guys probably could explain it to me to be able to put this all together. But this tells us that we really are reaching a broad swath of people and not just moving people across our single portfolio of shows, which is very heartening. And once again, now it gives us data that we can look at and track over time. So another question is the percentage of listeners who are consuming 2 or more of different shows. So this is a similar question, but it's a little bit different because now we're looking at these. On the left-hand side, you can see the show names. And so what we're looking at here is of people that listen to more than one show, where are those people listening? And so what we can find, you guys aren't experts in our programs, but the Brian Lehrer show, Leonard Lopate show that was on the air when this chart was pulled, it's no longer on the air, those are 2 local radio shows. And so what we see is that people that listen to our local shows are listening to a lot more of our content than people who are listening to our more nationally focused shows like Freakonomics and Radiolab. Radiolab is about the 3rd or 4th largest podcast in the world. The majority of listening is not in New York City, it's really outside of New York City. So this tells our marketing team an awful lot of things. It tells us that there's a huge opportunity to move people who are listening to our local shows across our portfolio, but you'll also see the total number of listeners is much smaller on those shows than it is on the national shows. So where do we put our marketing dollars? Do we put it toward the local shows where we know we can move people across it, or do we put it on the national shows where the upside is potentially much bigger? And once again, now we've got something that we can track and that we can measure and that we can use to see the effectiveness of our marketing dollars and everything else that we're doing. Also, what are the affinities between shows? So that just showed you if they were likely to listen to shows. Now we can also say that people who listen to Radiolab, of those who listen to more than one of our shows, they're much more likely to listen to Freakonomics or On the Media. Whereas, with Freakonomics, you can see some of the same shows, but this really helps us understand, once again, how we can grow our audience and how we can really broaden our reach. One thing that we've learned about podcasts is that the best way to get people to listen to podcasts is to have the host of a podcast somebody listens to recommend the next podcast that they listen to. And so without this data, we wouldn't know what to tell these people to recommend to their listeners. And so this has also been really, really impactful across our building. So then we had questions about how do we release this content. It used to, I don't want to say it was willy-nilly, but it was just, it was a little bit of this, the episode is ready to go, let's go get it out the door immediately. So now we could look at across time and across our whole portfolio, what days were better to release episodes. And this is really important because you want as many people as possible to listen to our content. And so what you can see here is that Monday's missing because it's the baseline. I don't know if you can see that on this monitor. There's a little line that goes up there. But what we can see here is that Wednesdays and Fridays are the best days to release content, that more people, this is across everything. And that more people are likely to listen. I don't know if that matches all of your life experience. It kind of matches mine, but I didn't realize it until I actually saw this data. Related to this, we also could look at what months are better to release new shows. So we spend an awful lot of time crafting new content. We will invest a ton of engineering time and producer time and reporting time, and we'll package together 8 to 15 episodes and say, this is a season of a show. When should we release that? In July, in May, in December? So now we actually have, over a long period of time, the ability to understand when people are more likely to listen to content broadly. And you can see here, it's really in the fall. Summer makes sense that it drops off, but it was news to me that winter and spring weren't as impactful. So all of this is really helping our marketing teams and our content teams really create better content and release it in ways that is much more likely to get a pickup across the board. Lastly, I mentioned the Looker before. A big piece of the work that we're doing, I'm not going to tear these apart, these are really just examples, but we now have across our whole organization living dashboards that everybody from a show producer to a membership manager to a marketing manager to a digital producer can use with live updating data across all of those different and disparate data sets. And it was data that was previously completely unavailable to them and opaque. And so we can now take all of those examples I was showing you, plus many, many more, and use them to make actionable decisions in, I don't want to say in real time, although that's a goal of ours, but in near real time, and in radio it might as well be real time considering the lead time that we used to have before. And so we've been pushing logins to the system across the organization, training people on how to use it, building out dashboards for people, and really doing deep analysis across everything. So we've only just started. This is about, as I said, about a 2-year-old effort with a very small, tight-knit team. Today we've got listening data and membership data and web stats and newsletters in here. Coming soon, we're going to be bringing in social data. We're going to be bringing in data from our sponsorship and ad systems. We're going to be bringing in our financial data, as well as a number of other data sets as well. And really, we were also one of the first places to do this in public radio, so we're also working across the entire public radio system to bring the data sets and the engineering that we have and helping that knowledge spread throughout the system. Because in this world in which public radio is really one of the last bastions of sustainable local journalism, we believe it's really important that we share this knowledge out across the entire country. And so we're working with NPR, with other major market stations, as well as with smaller stations across the country to help them leverage not just the insights, but also the technology and everything else that we have. So that's my talk. I would love to take any questions that anybody has.
In your efforts to get this data used more widely across the organization, as you mentioned, you encountered some resistance or some confusion. What did you do to create buy-in? And was there like an aha moment where you helped people really see what the data could do for them?
Yeah, so we had buy-in from the very get-go at the very senior level. And actually there was buy-in across the entire organization in a theoretical level, but you really haven't succeeded until people are using the data. It's not enough to say that they want it, you have to actually see them using it. And it has not been the easiest or quickest path to adoption. And some of that is due to really good things. We really don't want this data to be driving what stories we're covering or what content or new show we're going to be producing. We have some of the most creative people in radio working at that building, and we don't want to squash that creativity with just look at the numbers. And sometimes it takes a long time for a show to build up or whatever. But we've also been working in small groups across the company, and we've found kind of 2 techniques that have worked relatively well. So one of them is we're a very goals-oriented company. Even in a world in which we can't see all the data, we do have goals for every show that we have, and for the newsroom, for the radio station, and everything else. And so the first dashboards that we created were really the lightest ones. They weren't the ones that were showing deep, look across 10 data sets and answer really complex questions. It was really just providing people the base information that they didn't have before. So if you are the producer of On the Media, how is On the Media performing? How is it performing this week? How is it performing last month, et cetera? And that was data that was, we knew it kind of, but it was siloed. And so we worked throughout the company sitting down with different producers and walking them through this data. And then we looked for the teams internally that were the most hungry for this and really partnered with them to give them skin in the game. And then once they could show successes to their peers, then their peers would start coming to us. And there's still work that we need to do here, but one of our long-term goals is really to become a data literate and organization and to really use data in everything that we're doing.
I was wondering the correlation between the efforts you've been doing for the last 2 years in this area and how it correlates with membership growth. Any specific surprises in terms of membership growth? And also I noticed, I am a constant listener of this radio, so I noticed, for instance, matching grants is certainly something that is always being done, and it seems like the nature of that might be changing. So I'm just wondering how membership, how membership is responding to your efforts that's been going on?
Got it. So some of this is a little bit behind the scenes baseball, where it doesn't really, it affects people who listen to the station in it's kind of a subconscious way because the show's getting produced differently, but it's not really at the forefront. I didn't spend a lot of time in this talk talking about all the ways that we're using data in service of membership. But one thing that we found is on the engage piece of this. For example, most of our membership is based on people that listen to our radio stations. And a very small percentage of our membership is based on people that listen to our podcasts that are by and large consumed nationally or internationally. That is a huge growth opportunity for us. That's where the bulk of our audience is, but it's not where the bulk of our membership is. And so we have an across-the-board effort right now to really start engaging listeners in conversations so that we can start getting them to raise their hands, so that we can start knowing who they are. Some examples of this are a show we had called Note to Self did a sleep tracking study that was a great series of podcast episodes, but the host, Manoush, asked everybody to keep track of how much they were sleeping every night and go into a Google Doc and enter that data, and through that we got their email address and we were then able to remarket to them. And we are also looking at the cohorts across the company and across the listenership to figure out how better to position our membership messaging. So it has had a great impact on that. And just to your question about how membership is doing, it's doing very well, but there's a lot of ways to grow it.
So for listener data in particular, I guess you look at that and then you see what sort of content is attributed to that, and maybe change the content to change the listener behavior. I'm wondering, like, how much, like, if you address the idea of like how much can the content affect listener behavior, right? Like, if I make the best radio show possible, it's not going to make my commute any longer, so I'm not going to be listening any longer than it takes me to get to work. Do you have any idea? Do you talk about those types of questions?
So we don't talk about that too much. That doesn't mean that we won't in the future, but that really gets to that, is it data or is it a creative decision? So to the specific question about how long the episode should be, some of that is about the clock of the radio, where it's 30 minutes or, well, actually it's like 22 minutes or it's 48 minutes or whatever it is there, because you live and die by the clock. But even in podcasts, that in theory could be any length of time. We really are trying hard not to push people through data to make those types of creative decisions. That said, in the teams that are embracing this data more than some of the others, they are starting to look at that. We are certainly seeing a desire from some groups within the organization to really start looking at data and asking questions. We're getting surveys in market to be able to help them guide their content creation efforts. One of the areas where this has been really impactful, and that is understanding who it is that we're talking to. It's very easy to sit back and think, oh, there's a sports show and there's a finance show, they must be talking to two different audiences. And then you find out that no, actually they're talking to the same audience. And so then you start asking questions about, well, are they talking to the same audience because that's who we're able to reach, or are they talking to the same audience because we're producing them in the same way? And so those conversations are happening, but it's not really being driven 100% by this data. This data is just there as a tool to help answer those questions when they come up. I don't know if that answered your question.
How exactly are you sharing this with other radio stations you mentioned?
So we're sharing it in two ways. One is by sharing some of the learnings that we have in areas that would make sense to them. They don't care necessarily how many people that listen to the Brian Lehrer show also listen to the midday show, but they do care about, you know, different cohorts of people and what types of content they're listening to, or how it's responding, how those cohorts of people are responding to, say, a 30-minute episode as opposed to an hour, or different ways to produce content, right? Do you do your lead in and introduce people up front, or do you do it 10 minutes into the show, or what have you? But the more impactful way that we're working with this is, and we're in the very early stages of this right now, any radio station or podcast producer is going to have the same data sources that we have, by and large. There are going to be some differences in there, but by and large, everybody's 65% of podcast listening is happening on Apple, for example. So anybody who's creating podcasts is going to want to know what listening is happening over Apple or Spotify or things of that nature. And so we're in the very very early stages right now of talking to different funders to be able to take the database and the data warehouse and the BI layer that we have and extend it out in a way that's productized, where it can be used by multiple stations to put their data into it. Where, as I said, it's the early stages of this, so we don't know exactly how we're going to do the analysis piece of that, whether it's going to be centralized or distributed, and how we're doing education on that side. But we're working across the system of public radio right now to really tell people that this is available and see how they might want to work with it in the future.
Hi, my question's about goal setting. You said you were a goal-setting organization, so I imagine in the beginning it was just getting things up and running. But now that you've established yourself, how are goals being set?
Right, so in the past, we always had goals as an organization. We're very KPI focused, but those goals would be around Nielsen ratings, for example, or the number of members, right? Very easy things to track. Now we're getting into a world in which we are able to set goals at an organizational level around computed metrics, like lifetime value or churn rate, or which shows themselves are responsible for what amount of membership or audience or things of that nature. So it's allowed us to get deeper into the data and set goals at a deeper level within the organization, and also allow the individuals who are working in those areas to see the effect of the work that they're doing.
That's interesting, not quite what I was trying to get at.
Sorry.
What are the goals for your unit?
Not
how you evaluate others.
Got it. So for this year, I have a number of different units that work for me. For this unit, the goal, we work with OKRs. I don't know if you all are familiar with OKRs, but basically we're on a quarterly basis setting goals that are measurable and trackable. And so this unit, really their goals are around exposing additional data sets and making them available across the organization. We have goals around the number of times that end users log into the BI system, for example, because that's going to show the utility of this and how it's actually working across the organization. We have goals around reducing the error rate within the data, because there's always errors in data when you're putting things together. And so that group has very detailed and goals. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I think we have time for about one more question before we move on to Sisi, if anyone has one, but if not, we can just move into Sisi. But thank you so much, Nate.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to talk about something totally different, but that's why there's two of us, right? So I'm Sisi. I work at ProPublica. How many people here know what ProPublica is? Oh, it's so many of you. This is so great. Okay, so we've been around for 10 years, so it's very encouraging when people have heard of us. When I started working at ProPublica, I would say like 3 people in the audience would probably raise their hand, so this is very exciting. We do investigative journalism, and we are a nonprofit organization. My role there, I'm currently an assistant managing editor, and one of the teams that directly reports up to me is our news apps team. And that's also where I started in ProPublica as a news apps developer. The way that we define news apps is a little different. It is not an app with news on it in your phone. It is in fact you can think of it as an interactive database that's a public resource for people to use. So if any of you have used Dollars for Docs, it's probably the first news app we ever made. It allows you, if you live in the United States, to put in the name of your doctor. ProPublica will tell you how much money your doctor was paid by pharmaceutical companies, on what year, on what day, for what reason, and then also the most popular drugs that this doctor prescribes. And you know if you've been prescribed that drug. So have fun. That's my talk. No. So that's the kind of work that we do. But today I'm going to talk about a little something that we did that was a little different. And so we like to think about, if we're doing public interest journalism, investigative journalism, what are different ways we can use programming, data, and technology to help us really tell those stories in a way that's engaging. As you can tell from the talk title, I want to talk a little bit about how we make games to do investigative journalism, and how do you actually get at this idea of truth if you're letting people play a game. Because as you might imagine, it can get a little complicated. All right, so this is what ProPublica looks like. The main reason I'm showing this is also because yesterday we published one of our latest apps called Miseducation. It allows you to look up public and charter K-12 schools all across the country and the school districts and to see whether or not there's racial disparities between the opportunities that are being given to our children as well as how they're being disciplined. And we let you see that on a school-by-school basis across the entire country. That is very much the typical kind of work that we do, right? So through those two examples, you really get a sense of we're after these national data sets. Sometimes we have to compile them ourselves. Sometimes after we do that for a while, a law changes, and then it's a lot easier to get that data, which is great. And this is something that came out of the Department of Education. And I often like to say that our team would not have a job if the government did like a superb job at making all of their databases like beautifully accessible on the internet. Like we would just have nothing to do, really. And so that's sort of what's traditional. And so now I'm going to specifically talk about something very non-traditional. So this is a game that we published earlier this year. It's called The Waiting Game. And I'm just going to describe it a little bit for you. It's something that I worked on myself along with WNYC, which is actually really exciting, the data news team that Nate had mentioned briefly. There's a young woman who used to be a fellow at ProPublica, got hired as a data reporter at WNYC, and now also writes for Gothamist. So it's really like a whole cycle going on. But her name is Layla. Layla and I worked on this project along with the game company, and you'll hear a little more about how that worked. But the waiting game, basically the idea is this, which is there's a lot of coverage on immigration, right? And despite all of that, we found that most people actually did not know the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, right? It is both surprising and not surprising at the same time because both systems are actually quite complicated, and based on what is getting covered right now, I think it's actually very reasonable for a normal consumer to have those words be interchangeable in your brain unless you looked it up yourself. And what we were also interested in looking at, however, is that as the asylum law is getting changed, and trying to put this in like the most neutral way, because we'll get further. As asylum law is getting changed and very controversial parts of it are getting changed, we realized that there was a lack of reporting, not on the part of how do people become an asylum seeker, right? Like what happened in their home country, why do they want to come to the United States? That actually gets a good amount of coverage. What doesn't get coverage is what happens the moment they hit the border, right? So they show up to America. How do we treat them? How long are they here? There's a lot of rumors going around in terms of like, we'll just let them in, and that's just how it works. And we were like, this isn't like, we could write a piece that tells people like, here's how it works, here are the facts, and sometimes those pieces don't always do the best. And we were like, what if we just let people experience it for themselves? Can we pull that off? Can we pull that off and call it journalism? And what kind of data do we actually need to be able to do that kind of thing? So this game, very briefly, for those of you who don't know, there's basically 5 different criteria for why the United States would accept someone as an asylum seeker and actually give them asylum status in America. And so those are things that many of us are familiar with one category that's a little different. So it's for persecution, right, based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or this last one, which is the most controversial one, membership in a particular social group. And I want to dig into the history of asylum law just for 1 second, just so people understand the significance of that group, which is asylum is something that is an international system, and every country chooses to participate how they want to participate. The United States originally decided to participate because after World War II, there's a very famous case in which we turned away a ship of Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust, right? And we know for a fact that after they were sent back, I think at least, I don't remember what percentage, but a majority of the people that we could have let stay in America were killed in the Holocaust, right? And so after that, I'm boiling this down a lot, but after that, basically we decided like we should do something about this. And so we signed on to the UN Refugee Convention for what we would do, and these 5 areas came out of it. And the reason why membership of a particular social group sounds kind of like vague and blurry, right, is because the explicit goal was that in the future, there might be people of different classes that we want to protect that we haven't thought of today, right? And so that's really interesting, right? And so we built this game, and basically, this is what it looks like. It lets you pick and be one of 5 different people. They're in 5 different scenarios from 5 different countries. All countries that send a good number of asylum seekers to the United States, but each one represents one of those reasons. And they each have something different about them as well. And so it's basically an intersection of people's lives. What's also interesting about that, about us, is that if we make a game, it has to be accessible everywhere. So you can also play it on your phone. This is built using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. In fact, the data in the end is only extensive in word count, but is by no means big data. So we were storing it in a database for a while, and then we just baked it all out as flat files. Just didn't need to do more than that. So this is what the front end of the game looks like. You are all welcome to play if you would like. But how this came to be is a partnership, as I said before, between me at ProPublica, Layla Youngs from WNYC, and then Nick Fortunio is the CEO of Playmatics. He's the original designer of Diner Dash. If anyone has heard of that? I met Nick at a Games for Change conference. And so Nick and I have been trying to figure out a way to work together. After the election, Nick was like, I really want to do something with immigration. ProPublica covers immigration a lot. And so we put our heads together, and this idea basically came out of it. And then the fourth party, which is Dr. Kim Barnowski from Mount Sinai. She is extremely important because one of the reasons why we were able to do this game at all is because she helps run a clinic at Mount Sinai that essentially evaluates asylum seekers, both physically for their physical health as well as their mental health, and to figure out if they believe, oftentimes the asylum application is based off of like your first person account of what has happened to you. And so her clinic basically for free provides those evaluations that people use for when they're applying for asylum in asylum court. To either they can choose to say like, I don't believe this person, right? It's what they're telling me is not consistent, or everything that they're saying here, or even if some of the facts don't line up, is completely in line with someone who has PTSD from something like this, right? And so they make those judgments. They do it for free. They also essentially gave us access to anonymized versions of people's accounts they had vetted. And so that sort of really enabled this kind of work. Actually playing the game basically goes like this. You start out your day. I specifically here took out the intros for each of the stories so I don't spoil anything. But once you get past the intros, you play every single day in this person's life between the moment that they thought, I need to seek asylum in the United States, and the day that that part of their story ends. So either they get asylum or they don't get asylum. If they spend time in a detention center, you have to spend every single day with them. If they go to court, there's essentially a cutscene that tells you what happens. And if there are any major events in their lives, that's something similar. If they have to meet with their lawyer, but their lawyer is super shady and doesn't show up, you have to experience with them. And every single click that you make is one day in their life. The goal here is that we wanted people to experience both the fact that it's actually kind of monotonous, but at the same time there's this undercurrent of uncertainty the entire time. And so there were some great tweets after the fact that were pretty great where they said the horror and the humdrum are all mixed up in one, and that's really what we're going for. And the other thing is that in the game, we specifically are looking for people to quit. So you have really only 2 options right now. You can keep going or you can give up. And we designed the entire game with the idea that people just can't handle it. They're not gonna sit there and click continue for 2 years, right? Very reasonable. What I did not expect is that some people actually did do that. And so our high scores for each of the storylines are crazy. Some of them, I'll get into this a little later, but our high score for one of our stories was over 1,000 days. We have a little meter so that you can't just smash it. 1,000 days of play means hours of play in one sitting, basically. That's in one sitting, that is the fastest you can go, which is pretty incredible to me. But for everybody else who chooses to give up, who we designed this game for, they get something a little bit like this. which basically just says, this is the number of days you made it, right? And then it says, players on average last 13 days, right? And then it tells you what you experience is based off a real person. And they spent around 2,190 days in this kind of experience. And you shift with them through different scenes, right? If they get transported, different text shows up. A lot of what we worked with WNYC with as well, which you can't see in this presentation, is sort of the audio. So there are sound effects as things happen. There's background audio that flows with every single type of environment that you're in. And then there's an overall sort of layer of audio on top of that as well. And it makes for like a very calming yet eerie experience, I guess, is the way I describe it. But yes, so how did we do all of that? And also, how like truthified, right, can it be if we're giving you that much detail? And so this is where, right, this is where the difference between activism and investigative journalism comes in. In activism, I think you could actually make a version of this based on interviewing people who are asylees and experts, and by sort of giving you like a much shorter game. So it's sort of like, make this decision, then I tell you exactly what happened, and it's generally representative of somebody's experience. But usually what that kind of work does is it mashes together a bunch of different people's experience so that you can know, like, in the whole world, based on the stories, we know all of these bad things can happen to you, or these good things can happen to you, but to tell you about them, we have to put them all in one story. Or we put them all in 5 stories, but no one actually quite experiences the world in that way. And so we were not comfortable putting that out there as an experiential story and telling people, like, you should treat this as if it was completely real. And so the only way we were able to do this, let me see, is by doing a lot of extensive research and by using all of the information that we got from Mount Sinai's clinic on original affidavits of stories that they had been told, but then also how they had evaluated those stories. And then we filtered out the ones that we felt like were too vague. We fact-checked all of the stories themselves based on the things that we do know. By the end, I was able to figure out not what the original redacted things were, but I could tell what was redacted, and I had her verify for me because I could tell what wasn't true. I was like, well, it's not possible for you to go from this country to this country by foot. So I'm pretty sure the country that you've like redacted here is probably this one. And I was like, I don't need you to confirm it, but I need you to confirm that I'm not wrong and that this fact is not wrong, right? Like that you did not accidentally take something out that is actually true. And so this is a sketch of what I had a lawyer draw for me about what the layout of a detention center looks like in the opening like visitor area, because we have to describe things like what types of chairs and tables people sat on in that location, even though we don't tell you literally where it is. And so was just a lot of on-the-ground reporting. This is when I went to a courtroom in asylum court because we wanted to make sure that we weren't basing it off of sort of what our imagined version of court was. And this played into both fact-checking the sound effects as well as the stories themselves because, surprise, surprise, asylum court actually, there are no gavels. Like literally, there are no gavels. And so you can't have like a gavel sound, right, in the courtroom. And there are a lot of other things, like little details like that we had to get right. And these are for, narrative details as we describe things. But then, how do we write a script for like 2 years in somebody's life, right? And this is where we tell the audience up front. We basically tell you a couple of things. One is that all of the major events in this person's life happened to this person, right? So if you experience getting transferred from a detention center to another one in the middle of the night, real, that definitely happened. If for 60 days you're walking through the desert, not really knowing like when you're gonna get water next, that also definitely happened. But little environmental details, like on day 5 it rained a little. That is where we've only put in things that help you understand that time is passing and that could possibly happen during that period of time. And so the text actually looks a little bit like this. So when it actually is a series of opening events, we have like scripted text that definitely happens, and then where it just says E here, you can kind of ignore that it says E, but this basically means that there's additional text that will be generated in between these 2 blocks. And then we are going to start you off at this sort of mini cutscene again. And we've written a couple of these, well, actually that's not true. We've written let's say 20 cutscenes on average per storyline, and then everything in between is generated through procedural text. So here are just a sample of text that we wrote and Playmatics helped us write for weather in the desert, and then you in the desert. And so any combination of this type of text could show up. And all of the text is fact-checked to the best of our ability to the environment that we know it's in. So which desert, we know that, even if you might not know that. And what it does is we basically built this system that is not complicated, but essentially keeps track of between different cutscenes what sentences are eligible, and then it will randomly pick, based on different tags, a combination of those sentences to display for you together. So at any time there might be 3 sentences, 3 to 4, and it knows not to reuse them. It also knows, and what's important about this is at the very left you see that column of 4s. It knows because I have told it to be eligible or ineligible in between certain scenes. And so certain bits of text you'll never see later on in the story, but other bits of text you might see a lot earlier in the story because I want to stress something. And then there are little details spread throughout this stuff that is actual direct quotes and details that we got from those affidavits. So the one that I've highlighted here is that you can't carry your son today, a man traveling with you helps you carry him, that happened, right? And so the more specific we are, the more we know that it definitely happened, and the more vague we are, the more that it's sort of like a background detail. And what's really interesting too, writing this text, is that you can't say things that are definitive. So you can't say it was really hot today. You have to say it's hotter today, right? Everything's just slightly relative to the day before. And because we also wanted to give that sense that time is passing, but it's not about any particular day. Let's see. This is basically an example of things that are eligible between multiple scenes, and then scenes that are only eligible after certain scenes. And so something that happens with you and your lawyer has to happen based on our reporting and based on some of the knowledge we have. Some of it has to happen within 2 weeks of a major event happening. And because somebody experienced, basically 0 communications until then. So we had to also build in different ways for the system to be able to ingest our text as timed information in that capacity. And then finally, this is sort of just how much we wrote. So El Salvador was about 600 phrases, and in the end, adding all 5 up together, we had about 3,500 phrases. What's kind of hilarious about that is that it's about 50,000 words, and a typical article at ProPublica is between 5,000 and 15,000. And we write a lot more than most other news organizations that write because of long-form investigative journalism, so much so that internally we say 5,000 words is 1 ProPublica. And so 50,000 words is many, many ProPublicas, and we had 3 people at our organization edit every single word that was written into the game, no matter how it would end up being generated coming out, to make sure that we never cross that line between this is something we definitely know, and this is something phrased as if we definitely know it. So that's pretty cool. And then the last little bit of, that I want to throw in here is that this is just a mirror image of an illustration that we have in the game. But when it comes to journalism and fact-checking everything that happens, right, we do that for the audio, we do that for the text, and the illustrations that we commission, we do the same. The reason why we had to do this is that in half the countries, you drive on a different side of the road, and the car steering wheel is positioned on the different side of the car. And so we had to go through and make sure that every illustration that we were putting into anything was able to follow all of the things that make sense for that story as well. And so there's sort of just a intensive amount of fact-checking that goes into it. Before I get to questions, the last thing I'll say too is that when Mary and I first talked about this game in particular, I was like, well, it doesn't actually use a ton of data, right? It's a lot of stuff that we gathered, that we created. It's using text as manipulatable elements to tell a story. And we had a moment in which we could have chosen to use data. We had gotten a lot of immigration statistics based on every country in the world and who is coming at what rate from which country, how likely are they to be different types of asylum seekers. We made the visualizations because we're good at that. That's what we normally do. And we were like, this looks like everything else. Like, it looks like what everybody else is doing. And if people have done that and people still don't get it, we want to try something else. So we ended up going with this. And we made like a little map that goes into the story that explains the history of asylum. And I think ultimately this was a lot more powerful. Like, I've had, for us, anecdotally, people write in, and that's just what people do to journalism organizations. They write in. Most of the time it's like, I'm so angry. But for this story, it was actually really great. There were people, and anecdotally this makes sense, that the people who are most compelled to play the game are most likely to write in. But there are some people who wrote in that was like, I played 600 days of this game, and like, I just felt like I've never understood what it was like before, now I do, right? And the stories like that are always really nice, and I'm pretty sure that if we had gone the traditional route, there's no way we would have accomplished that kind of impact, like even secretly, like that people would feel that way and not tell me. And so it was an interesting experiment for us to leave our big data sets and to go into something like this, and to try to give people that experience. So with that, questions? And I put Nick's Twitter up there as well because he and I really built this game together, so.
Hi, Sisi. Thank you so much. This was such a fascinating presentation. I learned so much, and I can't wait to play.
I'm glad.
My question is about the early stage of the project's development, and when you were fleshing out the game and whatever console. I want to know about the process that you went through in deciding on this format, and what kinds of different stakeholders you involved in the project as it evolved. Like, did you ever were members or asylum seekers ever consulted? Or anybody, I mean, obviously with respect to confidentiality, but it would have been, I imagine, an interesting perspective to have and to see what the appetite would be for players from an audience like me or a completely different type of person. Like, who was your audience, and I want to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So many things to say. I'll talk about the audience bit first, and then I'll talk a little bit about process. So in terms of the audience, we tested it on basically all of our sources, right? So we had interviewed people who are country experts. One of the things you have to do as an asylum seeker sometimes is prove that you actually are from the country that you say you're coming from. And if the court has a reason not to believe you, and you're lucky enough to have like a lawyer represent you either pro bono or paid, and they know to ask for a country expert to testify and interview you on your behalf. So we talked to like very, very different people who are all involved in this process. And then the actual asylum seekers who, whose stories that we have are aware that some version of their story will show up. And when I say some version, I mean we redact things based on how likely we think it is that someone would be able to identify a person. And so in some stories, you'll notice we'll go so far as to tell you what city you're in, but in other stories, you'll be like in an area. And so different stories have different levels of that because of how common certain things are. But that's sort of how we set out to do it. What was actually really interesting is that because we partnered with WNYC, I was on the Brian Lehrer show talking about this. And Brian Lehrer, being the guy that he is, basically put the question out there that was like, if you're listening right now and you have sought asylum in the United States, call it, right? And we were like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? And what was amazing is that he got so many people to call in, and they had very different stories of how they were to come, and actually a lot of stories that were exceptions to the rule X number of years ago. But to a lot of them too, they were like, all of the challenges that you are describing fit exactly with my experience, which was a really great way to do it, because at that point they weren't people that I had like consulted as sources in any way, right? They were just like random people listening to the radio, and that was really great. We really cared about what Mount Sinai thought, because they actually interact with the asylum seekers every day, and they do it pro bono, right? But then we also didn't want to lean too heavily to this being like a series of 5 human interest stories, because that doesn't achieve sort of ProPublica's greater mission, which is to have some sort of impact or to invoke some sort of change, right? And so for us, the process actually was quite simple. And I think it's because of the way that newsrooms think about this, which is we had, as people developing the game, me, and then Nick, and closer to the second half of development, Layla. And then in between, like I'm not beholden to what any of the sources say, right? And so I can show them parts of it, or show them things that don't even look like the game, but I'm trying to check whether or not something's true. And basically the way that works is that if I'm getting inconsistent feedback from different people, then I have to ask more people. Or I have to figure out why that's the case. And very frequently we found out some really like weird parts of asylum law, but when we were able to get to a point in which people who had nothing to do with each other were telling me like that sounds like the right thing, is when we would essentially move on. And then at the end, we had a lot of people review just the text without fully disclosing to them like how it would actually look, right? It's sort of just like, if you read this text, like, do you feel like that is something that is representative of your experience? And what we're trying to do is here, essentially, is represent 5 exact experiences, because I don't want to create composites, essentially. But we did a lot of random stuff at the beginning. We were like, maybe like you'll have inventory because people have items that people give them or force them to give up, and we quickly got rid of that. We're like, no one wants to interact with that. It's not part of the experience. Originally, we thought everybody would give up, so we actually didn't plan so much to write so much of the story. Like we thought we could cover the first year, and then it became really obvious that people want to fast forward and just see what happens. And then we're like, oh, okay, like now we really have to write all of it. And so that's also why the fast forward button. So if you choose to give up the first time, after that you unlock the fast forward button, in which you can go forward in time, which I learned from a mobile game that I was playing at the time that I really like. And but we don't give you that experience right away. Like if you're not willing to at least try, you don't get to fast forward in the story. But those types of features came near the end, because we discovered as we were playtesting that people wanted to know more, even if they weren't willing to sit through the whole thing. And I think it's a fair thing for a member of the public to do, which is like, okay, I've experienced some of this, and like I'm ready to give up now, and then we offer them the option, do you want to see what happened, right? And they can just skip to all the cutscenes. So, yeah. Other questions?
Thanks for this really fascinating talk. I am something of a curmudgeon, so I usually hate games, but I kind of had a thought a while ago that as far as tech inducing empathy in people, games is probably the best way to do it, and this seems to support that kind of thought that I had. And this in particular just seems so extremely thoroughly, thoughtfully designed. I wonder if Nick said anything about how designing for this game or developing for this game compared to other games.
Yeah, Nick and I gave a version of this talk together at Games for Change, and one of the things that makes total sense to me after the fact is that Nick has never made a game in which there's this much rigor applied to the actual facts and the interactions of the game. And he was a fantastic partner while we were doing this, because the team that I came from and the team that I run has a development background, and so we were trying not to be like, let's just like, can you just let us in the code? Like, and eventually that actually did end up happening, because we had to design the whole thing to be in our style, because we have a certain like design aesthetic at ProPublica. But when we were actually making this, he was like, when it comes to journalistic calls, like you tell me what we can and cannot do. And there were thousands of lines of text that we wrote and cut, because I would like literally go through and be like, nope, 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 can't show that. And we would cut that out, and then we would have to refill those spaces because a certain number of time has to pass, right? And then as we were recreating these timelines of like 35 days in this location, 60 days in location, does it actually take you 10 days to go from here to here, right? And we would like do some research into that as well. And Nick was super great about just being like, go wild, do whatever you need to do, I'm not gonna say no. And I think I think he's really enjoyed the experience, and we wanna work together again. But he definitely said that was something that was really different for him, that no one, like he works with a lot of nonprofits to apply this kind of thing, but because when you're specifically trying to communicate a message, you have a lot more liberty actually than in journalism when you're specifically trying to tell us like a real person's story. And so, yeah, I think that's probably what I would imagine is the biggest difference for him. Yeah. Any other questions?
You were saying you want to change people's opinions. Do you track who plays the game? And are people who might be sympathetic to asylum seekers the ones who play, or do build the wall people who play this game also?
This is a great question. So I don't know exactly who plays the game. That part, ProPublica doesn't track information about people who use our site in that way. We only track like generic information. And so I don't actually know political leaning of the people who play. The best I can do for us is based on who is like actually verbally responded, or who ProPublica has like a lot of different ways of engaging readers to try to get information if you're interested in a topic, right? And from that, what I can say is people who are sympathetic definitely enjoy playing the game. That part is true. The most interesting change that I've seen is that people who don't know much about the topic at all, like who don't really have an opinion, after playing the game, have expressed, one, a desire to know a lot more about what happens, and then two, this general sense that like it's all a lot more complicated than what you normally read. And that was very interesting. And then specific people have said like, you know, this has really helped me understand like how we treat human beings that are coming to America for support. But what I have not seen yet, what I'm hoping to see through other efforts, is that there's not a camp of people who have been like, hey Sisi, I used to think that asylum law should be completely abolished, and now I've really decided otherwise. I've not seen that kind of response. I was not aiming for the people in the middle, but I think that's sort of where we found ourselves, which is not bad. But we are thinking about other ways to engage people more. And I will say the last part is that there are a lot of immigration reporters who work at ProPublica who have played the game. And one of the things that I thought was really amazing about feedback I've gotten from them is that they do a lot of on-the-ground reporting, talking to people that go through this. And what they said was, what we have learned the most actually though is that I had no idea what a day-to-day experience in a detention center was truly like. And that despite all the reporting that they do and the stories and the anecdotes they get from people, that this type of explanation of what the unglorious parts of it are like were very helpful and informative to them and shaped sort of how they understand the system.
I'm wondering about how you dealt with telling the more traumatic parts of people's stories, because empathy is part of your goal.
Yeah.
But so is this kind of more non-partial journalism, and obviously the two are not at odds. But how did you think about that, and was it different from how you would think about something that wasn't gamified, where people would be almost have a harder time identifying with a paragraph than they would having those pieces in a scene?
Yeah, so part of the building empathy is that the whole thing is written in the second person, right? So it's like you, your son, right? And so you go through a traumatic experience is very intense. And so it's a really good question because we had to grapple with this. So what we essentially did was that even though we weren't going to walk you through everything that originally happened to you to get you here, you need some of that for background, right? And we also did not want this to become some sort of sidetracked piece in which we dive deep into trauma. There's a lot of doors you open if you do that, and this game is not the place to be able to explore that in the right way. And so we built in this mechanism called a flashback that acts like a cutscene. We know what actually happened in the flashback in real life. And we write the flashback so that you get a sense of it, but it's not extremely graphic, right? So it's also not let's say we're talking about domestic violence, right? We don't really narrate that happening, but we narrate what happens right before. And then what we do is later on, we narrate your like how you reflect on your memories to tell you what happened without forcing you to experience trauma. So that you get a sense of it without, like, you would never really, like, literally tell yourself, right, what happened. So we didn't want to write it that way either. But we sort of come at it from memories. And then because this is also related to how people prove that their stories are true in asylum court, we also give you a lot of little hints based on scars that you might have on your body, but then also that the way that you interact with family members that may or may not be with you. And so we try to come at it sort of sideways, in ways that like a normal human being would be reminded of something without literally forcing you to go through it yourself. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone has one?
Sorry, but I had to. Just specifically off your last response, I'm really interested in like the behavioral side. Like how did you decide to use memory? How did you decide to, like, when you're building information in, it just strikes me that it's very much a physiological experience that you're trying to create.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, just wait until you've had, like, if you follow our instructions, which says put headphones on before you play, because that whole experience becomes like a totally different thing. I would say it's not based on science. We definitely consulted experts a little bit, but not from the perspective of like what physical reactions are we going to elicit from people if we write it like this. I think a lot of that is drawn from just the way that we normally write investigative pieces and how we tell stories, right? And then the other side of it, I think that's sort of my side of it, and then the other side of it is Nick's experience with like how do you create games and what types of actions elicit what types of reactions from people. And to go back to that earlier comment about building empathy, right? The reason why, and this is the reason why I was interested in exploring games to begin with, which is journalism in a certain way is just about building empathy, right? Like without empathy, it's hard for people to care about any of the things you write about. But journalism, text journalism, like many other mediums, including video, photo, and even to a very large degree interactive graphics, which is a lot of my previous work, doesn't actually, like you can build sympathy and empathy through different ways. But the key reason why games can do it is because games force you to take an action, and then the same game allows you to be responsible for that action, right? And so in a movie, you can feel for the characters because you have similar experiences, or you can understand why someone would make those decisions. But you're never, it's very rare. I'm sure many of you have experienced like moments in theater or in movies where they break the fourth wall and they're like, oh, you're still sitting there, like watching this terrible thing happen to someone and you haven't said anything, right? Like they can get touches of that, but with games, you truly force people, if they're gonna play, to play. And then once they play, the things that they decide to do or not to do comes back and becomes the reason why something else is happening. And that's sort of one of the, I guess, key parts of why we wanted to try something with games, is so that people could also feel like they were a part of it, as opposed to watching it unfold. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sisi and Nate, once again. And thank you all for coming. Before we end, we just have Matt is going to come speak really quickly about the next UX and data meetup as we are spin off of that.
Okay. Thanks, Mary. Hi, everyone. So UX and data meetup is our sibling meetup. And the next one is going to be on Tuesday, October 23rd. We're going to have Abe Rubenstein from Enigma Public. And he's going to come talk about some very strange things going on in public data sets called probing the peculiarities of public data. And it'll be at a place near Grand Central. It won't be in this location, but it should be a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again very soon.